an important question to ask when you're thinking about conflict resolution is, why do some negotiations succeed and some fail? And including, of course, the ones in which third parties not directly involved in the conflict. Why do they succeed or fail? I mean, if we knew the answer to this question, there'd be far less conflicts. And so it's a very highly studied issue. One of the most respected and, I believe, insightful theories is one that William Zartman fielded back in the 1980s. It's borne a lot of scrutiny. It holds up quite well. This is the theory of ripeness. Just like a fruit getting ripe, the theory of ripeness for conflict resolution. And in other words, if a conflict is not ripe for resolution, I'll explain what this is later, it's probably not going to be resolved. And that's dissatisfying, but something that can be very helpful to negotiators when they're working their way through trying to resolve these conflicts. Zartman began his theory, and others, of course, have observed and confirmed it, that most studies about resolving conflicts focus on the substance of the proposals. In other words, let's use an extreme example where people are actually fighting. A civil war, insurgents are fighting the government. Surely they have grievances. And if you could work out a good substantive arrangement that would satisfy most, maybe not all, but most of these grievances, it stands to reason that they would stop and you would have conflict resolution. But Zartman, he adds the insight that timing is critical. So it's not just the substance of proposals. Of course, there's a lot of skill there, and deals can be made or broken in the substance. But also, we need to think more about the timing. So why do parties fight? And by fight, I don't necessarily mean armed conflict, although I mean that. But I mean, why are they willing to pay high costs to keep fighting, often in a prolonged manner, and resist efforts to resolve conflicts, even when they're suffering under economic sanctions, or their countryside is being bombed, and disrupted, and people are being dislocated from their homes? I mean, put yourself in those situations and think about how disruptive that is. And nevertheless, they fight on. And they get many, many followers to fight on. I mean, these are popular movements. So not to be too reductionist, but in most cases, they fight because they think they can win. If you think you can win, why agree to some negotiated settlement that falls short? You have to give a little, the other side has to give a little, and you fall short of your goals. If you think you can win, just hang in there and you'll get all of your goals. You'll be victorious in every sense. So as long as parties are convinced they can win, I offer you the thought that perhaps negotiations, while you should always keep talking, probably are not ripe for revolution. Now, Zartman builds on this idea of winning. He says, okay, so when is the condition when you cannot win that you become ripe for resolution? Remember, if one party wins and one loses, the conflict's over too. So this is a case where both parties are sustaining a conflict, and their fortunes are rising and falling, but the war continues. So his insight is they can no longer win when they have what's called a mutually hurting stalemate. When a mutually hurting stalemate arises, arguably that's the time when good negotiating, substantive proposals can lead to conflict resolution, because, as Zartman says, the dispute is ripe for settlement. All right, so what constitutes a mutually hurting stalemate? Well, there's a couple of things. First, it has to be on both parties' side, both of the combatants. They have to find themselves locked in a conflict from which they cannot escalate to victory. And same part of this part, but they cannot do so easily. In other words, the stalemate is painful. Okay? So the parties find themselves locked in a conflict from which they cannot escalate to victory, and this stalemate is painful. Okay? Now the second part of a mutually hurting stalemate is they see what Dartman calls a way out. So in other words, things are not hopeless. They're not going the way we wanted. There could be a way out. Now, we wouldn't have accepted the way out before we arrived at the mutually hurting stalemate, but now that we're there, and now that it's getting painful, somebody's offering us a way out, or we ourselves see a way out. Hey, I think we can probably resolve this conflict. So remember, importantly, that a mutually hurting stalemate has to be in the heads of the warring parties, or the parties that disagree. It's not an objective situation. We could look at the conflict in Syria, for example, and say, Syria is being destroyed. People are being dislocated in massive numbers. There'll be starvation soon. The various aid organizations cannot get in there. So why do they still fight? We see what we can perceive perhaps to be a mutually hurting stalemate. They don't. They don't. The mutually hurting stalemate has to be in the minds of the parties engaged in the conflict. I stress that the mutually hurting stalemate is in the minds of the combatants. And so third parties can be very effective at this point. First, they can offer a way out where the parties, that are really deeply engaged in military action or the battle, aren't really willing to see it. And then if there's already, this can be done in two ways, in other words. First, they can help the parties see a way out that already exists. The second part is the third parties can help construct a way out. They can offer, how about a little bit of aid following the conflict so we can rebuild your country? How about if we help train your army, train your police force, train your courts? How about if we stimulate your economy in the following ways, right? They can create a way out, even if the combatants aren't seeing it, because it doesn't exist. Third parties can create one. So those are the two ways. We can remind them or make them aware of a way out that maybe does exist, or we can create one. Now, I want to stress in closing that just because the condition is ripe doesn't automatically create the resolution. It's more of a permissive atmosphere. The parties now are inclined to consider a way out where before they weren't, because they thought each one individually thought they could win. Okay, so what ripeness does is create a setting where both parties are willing to consider initiating fruitful negotiations. And so I think this is when the involvement of third parties in constructive ways can really be very effective.